Hello all, welcome back. Okay, this is going to be lecture 8, and in fact, we're going to skip chapter 11. It's interesting stuff, but it doesn't really fit in this book. This book is all about institutions, and so this sort of philosophical and normative discussion of elections is not all that useful. So we're going to skip chapter 11. I won't ask you anything about it. And we're going to jump straight into chapter 12, parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential democracies making and breaking governments. Okay, so section 1 starts with the classification of democracies from parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential. The classification rules depend on the relationship between the government, which comprises the chief executive, the political chief executive, so whether that be the prime minister or the president, and the ministers that head the various government branches, right? So, the Foreign Affairs, the Department of Education in America, the Department of the Interior, these sorts of things. And then the legislature and the president, if there is one, and how they interact. Okay? And so if you look at figure 12.1, we're talking all about democracies. There are no more autocracies in this chapter. And the first question to be asked is the government responsible to the elected legislature? And if not, then it's presidential, right? Like if you can't just disband the legislature through the constitutional rules in your country, through early elections or a vote of no confidence or whatever it is, then you're a presidential democracy. If the government is responsible to the elected legislature, then we have to ask, is the head of state popularly elected for a fixed term? If the answer is yes, then you have a semi-presidential system like France, where you have a president, but you also have a prime minister. And if the answer is no, then you have a parliament. And a good example of this would be Britain or England, where they don't have a president. They have a queen who is not elected and who has very little power. And but they have a prime minister, basically, who right now is Keir Starmer. Okay, so moving on to section 1, is the government responsible to the elected legislature? And we'll talk about legislative responsibility. This is just the idea that the majority has the power to remove the government for office without cause. So generally, this is a vote of no confidence. And what happens is the prime minister and their either party or coalition will bring up a particular piece of legislation. If the legislation does not pass or is so despised that it does not receive a majority of votes in the parliament, then generally the parliament is disbanded and a new election will be called. There will be a caretaker government, basically the same people who were in government when the legislature was disbanded, who will take care of the government while elections are run and a new government is chosen. But there are generally rules about they cannot implement big policy changes while they are the caretaker government. Okay. And again, this is generally through a vote of no confidence. Let's see. Some examples here are Belgium, Israel, Germany, Spain. And remember that presidential democracies like South American democracies and like the United States do not have these methods to remove the legislature. They're generally on fixed electoral terms. In the United States, it's 4 years. In England, it's 5 years. And even in presidential democracy, or excuse me, parliamentary democracies, there are fixed terms for elections, right? So in Britain, where we have a parliamentary democracy, you must have an election 5 years after forming your government. But you can have an election at any point in those 5 years, right? So you can call an early election if you think your party is going to do awesome, which is problematic. We'll talk about. Or you can wait the 5 years in governance, and then elections will be called on a scheduled basis. Okay, section 1B. Is the head of state that's a hard word for me, popularly elected for a fixed term? In presidential democracies, the government does not depend on a legislative majority to exist. Um, and in parliamentary democracies, the democracy depends on the legislative majority, and there is no popularly elected head of state. And in semi presidential democracies like France, you will have both a legislative majority and a popularly elected president. Um, and so that's what we see in France right now. And generally, like the prime minister will be in charge of domestic affairs, and the president will be in charge of foreign affairs, but not necessarily. Okay, section 1C, an overview. Just some basic facts. Parliamentary democracies are the most common, right? And if you look at that map that they provided, we can see that the vast majority of European democracies, especially, are parliamentary. Presidential democracies are very common in South America. And like I said, semi presidential and parliamentaries, mostly parliamentary, dominate the European scene. Um, Section 2, making and breaking government. So we'll talk about parliament first. So the setup is usually that you have a prime minister. Um, okay, what happens is there's an election. Say my party, the Justin Party, won 51% of the seats. They make me prime minister. So the voters don't actually get to vote on who is the prime minister. What happens is they vote for the legislatures, then they take account and decide who has a majority of the legislature, the number of seats, or who can build a coalition, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then the majority party or the coalition will determine who is going to be the prime minister. And then the prime minister gets to choose who heads the departments, right? Um, and you have what's called collective cabinet responsibility. And this means that basically, like the cabinet ministers are allowed to complain all they want in private when we're making the decisions as a government. But once a decision is made, you will support the government and their decision, right? So in public, you keep your mouth shut or you resign, basically. Um, Okay, section 2B, the government formation process. So again, the voters only vote for the legislatures. They do not vote for a president, they do not vote for cabinet positions, and they do not vote for prime minister. The legislators themselves choose a prime minister. So a lot of times the voters will not know who the prime minister is going to be. Sometimes the party will signal, look, this guy is going to be our prime minister, or this woman will be our prime minister if we are elected. Uh, but the voters don't get to directly elect the prime minister. Okay. The governing party or coalition must keep a majority, generally, or risk a vote of no confidence. Most parliamentary democracies practice PR rules, proportional representation. This means that, say, we have 6 parties in the system. Um, one party gets 15% of the vote. They'll get 15% of the national legislative seats. Uh, England is a little different, right? Because they have basically a 2-party system with sort of majoritarian first past the post rules like we do here in the United States. Um, but they still have a prime ministership and a parliamentary democracy. They just have fewer parties and they don't really use proportional representation rules. The prime minister always gets to appoint the cabinet members. This is basically the biggest power in these types of systems. And this will be the new government until there is a new election or until there's a vote of no confidence, which will bring an early new election. Okay, a simple model of government formation. This is section 2B. So here we're going to talk about the minimum winning coalition. So the idea here is that, say you're in a parliamentary system, your party won 40% of the vote, another party won 35% of the vote, and one party won 11, and so on, right? The idea is that you're not going to mix with the big opposition party, right? Because in order to do so, you have to dole out benefits. And so The benefits generally come by way of either policy being implemented in a certain way or cabinet positions. Cabinet positions are a way to buy off a party uh, to ensure their loyalty to the coalition, right? And so, what you want is a minimum winning coalition. You want around 51%, right? So that if you pull in 60% in a coalition, then you're going to have to give a lot more to that party that sort of overgrows you over 50%. Um, and so what we have is a minimum winning coalition. You want to try to build as close to around 50 plus 1% of the legislature so that you can keep as many cabinet positions as you want, right? You maximize your own party's power when it comes to creating policy. You reduce the number of cabinet positions that you have to give away, and you reduce the ideological disagreements that exist in the system, right? And so this brings up Gamson's law. Gamson's law says a prime minister must give portfolios to other parties in proportion to the number of seats that each party contributes to the government's legislative majority. So, like I talked earlier, we have 40%. My party won 40%. I want to pull in that party that won 11%, as long as they're like close to me ideologically, so that I don't have to give away, so that I only have to give away, say, 11% of the cabinet positions rather than 20 or 30% to an opposition party, right? They also try to build what's called a connected coalition. So you also have an incentive to bring in parties that are ideologically close to you, right? It's very unlikely that some far right party is going to join or coalesce with, say, a Green Party or a Communist Party, right? That just doesn't make sense. They at least have to have some sort of ideological congruity. Okay. Section 2C, different types of government. Sometimes we get minority government. And this kind of breaks the rules of the minimum winning coalition. This is pretty rare, but sometimes a minority party may run the government. And there's a couple of reasons for this, right? Uh, because the opposition could remove the government at any time, there has to sort of exist at least an implicit majority in the system. So even if they're not actually in your coalition, they might be willing to vote for your stuff just so the government doesn't collapse, right? Sometimes the ruling party will try to build majorities for each piece of legislation that it passes. So it will stay in a minority, but then for every piece of legislation, it will try to pull in a party or two so that when there is a vote, there will not be a vote of no confidence, even though you don't necessarily run a majority of the number of legislative seats. This is most likely to occur where minority parties have a strong say over policy. So, if they have really strong, say, committee positions, or if there's really strong rules about the legislators having to participate with interest groups, right? Unions, business leaders, these sorts of things. Where you have more input by those people, you should have more, minority coalitions. So I guess the question is, why would you rather shape policy from committees rather than a cabinet position? And there's quite a few reasons, right? The first is that you can just avoid liability, right? If your name isn't attached to that piece of legislation as a political party, you have, plausible deniability. And so you're not as attached to that piece of legislation if it becomes a failure. Well, you can claim that legislation if it's successful, right? Number two, incumbents tend to lose votes in subsequent elections, right? So we know for a fact, basically, that like if you're a majority party, you almost always lose seats in the next election, and this is because every action you make pisses off some segment of society, right? The third is that pre election pledges not to be in a coalition with particular parties happen. So, for example, right now, a lot of parties in Europe are saying, look, we are seeing this rise in far right parties, but we absolutely refuse to participate with them or allow them a position in our government. So you're seeing this in Denmark, you're seeing it in Germany with the rise of the AFD, you're seeing it in Belgium, you're seeing it in a lot of different places where the far right party is on the rise, but the rest of the legislators are saying, look, those guys are freaks. We don't believe in any of that. We will not let them participate in our government. They will always be outsiders. And then finally, you have sort of future flexibility, right? Because you're not tied to a policy. So that's kind of tied into number one about being held responsible, right? So if your party's name is not actually on the legislation, then you have a little bit more flexibility in the future. So we just talked about minority governments. There are also occasionally surplus governments where you get away from this idea of the minimum winning coalition and you actually get a much larger majority party or majority coalition. There are a couple of reasons for this. One, we tend to see this a lot when a new state is created or when there's some sort of national emergency, like a war, a civil war, an economic collapse, something of that sort, where everyone sort of wants to show unanimity and that like we can run a government, right? Sometimes there's supermajority rules where, say, you have to have, like in the United States, if you want to pass an amendment to the Constitution, you need two-thirds of both houses and two-thirds of all the states, right? And so in some countries, like Belgium in particular, where they have really tight rules about ethnicity because of there's the Walloon, the Flemish, the German speaking, the French speaking, all of these different ethnicities clashing in one country. Anytime you want to write a law that affects more than one ethnic group, basically, you have to have a supermajority. You have to have two-thirds or more. So this is another reason to sort of build one of these surplus majority governments. In a minimum winning coalition government, if a single party drops out, so say I have 46% of the votes, I brought in a party with 5% to build this 51% majority. Well, unfortunately, that party with 5% has remarkable power, right? They can sort of strong arm me, even though I have a much bigger party and a much bigger electoral showing, they can strong arm me into writing legislation that is far more in line with their perspective because all they have to do is say, I'm taking my ball and going home, and the entire government collapses. And so some prime ministers who are concerned about like that one party who's a little bit iffy, they'll add another party or two to ensure that they don't have that sort of extreme veto power. And then number four is about pre electoral coalitions. A lot of times before the election even comes about, they'll say, okay, I'm with the Green Party. I'm going to build a coalition with the Social Democrats and the Communists, say, if our party or if our coalition in general gets elected, right? And it's a way to signal to voters that this is the kind of government we want to build. Okay, Section 2C, duration of government, formation, and survival. These are just some basic statistical facts about these kind of states, excuse me. So formation, it generally takes about, on average, a month to form a government. There's a lot of haggling behind the scenes. There's a lot of promises being made. There's a lot of promises about who's getting what cabinet positions, what kind of policy we want to enact, all these sorts of things, right? And so in parliamentary democracies, it takes a lot longer to put a government together. Britain is kind of the exception because it's mostly a two-party system. But in a lot of those PR systems like Italy, Portugal, Spain, it takes quite a while. The Netherlands, Belgium, some of them have taken more than a year to put them together. And then when we talk about survival, governments tend these parliamentary governments tend to last about 60 to 65% of their time before the next election. So again, I remember I said in England you have to hold elections at minimum every 5 years. So this would suggest that about every 3 years the government collapses and they pull a vote of no confidence and they have to pull in another election, right? So they only tend to last about 60% of their time in office. Single party coalitions tend to have, not coalitions, single party dominant governments tend to have the longest expected life of 900 days. The minimum winning coalition is the next uh, longest lasting at about 890 days. So very close. And then as you break away to surplus and minority governments, they last shorter and shorter periods of time. Okay, section 3, making and breaking governments. This one we're going to talk about presidential democracies, right? And so one of the major differences between presidential and parliamentary systems is that the president is the formateur of the cabinet, not the legislature and not a prime minister, right? So the president himself or herself actually chooses the makeup of the cabinet. There can be input from the legislature, but it's not their decision. It is the president's decision. Um, the legislature is on a fixed temporal election cycle, right? So in America, it is every 4th year. Well, that's not true. In America, it is every other year for the House of Representatives, and it is every 6th year on 1/3 splits for the Senate, right? So every 2 years you'll have a senatorial election, but it will only be approximately 33 of the senators every 2 years, right? So that you run a 6-year term. Regardless of the length of the term, it's about there are fixed terms, right? You cannot have a vote of no confidence. You can't disband the legislature. None of these sorts of things. Let's see. Presidents tend to have what's called the power of decree. These are presidential orders with the force of law. Most of South America, the presidents can actually implement their own laws, right? The United States is a little bit different. We have what are called executive orders. And executive orders mean that the president can only, quote, regulate and interpret statutes that are already enacted by the legislature and give orders to the administration, right? So the law has to exist, and then the president can tweak it or sort of make it more focused or whatever it is, or tell the administrative bureaucracy how to enforce those sorts of laws. Whereas a lot of South American presidents can actually dictate laws themselves. Okay, and then the composition of presidential cabinets. The only thing to say here really is that presidential cabinets tend to be different than parliamentary cabinets in that parliamentary cabinets tend to be fully political choices, right? These are legislators, these are long term government employees, these are high ranking officials in the political parties. Whereas in presidential systems, you get a lot more non legislative ministers, right? So you get a lot of business leaders, you get a lot of scientists, you get a lot of cronies, right? Especially in South America. But I would love to point to, say, the Obama administration in America, where he didn't have a lot of political appointees. What he did was appoint top scientists in the field to each bureaucracy, um, rather than sort of political nominations. Okay. The final system is a semi presidential democracy. This is kind of a weird mix. The legislature can be dismissed in a vote of no confidence, and they do have a prime minister, but they also have a fixed term president. And so France is a good example here, where they elect the president. Macron is the president right now, but they also have a prime minister and legislative coalitions and things of this sort. So it's just sort of a mixed system, right? Um, and basically, they say, the only thing we really have to be concerned with is cohabitation. Most of the time, what happens is the prime minister and the president are from the same party because the voters tend to vote the same ideologically. But occasionally, what happens is called cohabitation, where the president is from a different party than the prime minister. This can be really problematic, especially if you look at some of the post-communist countries like Ukraine, Georgia, some Czechoslovakia, some of those nations. Whereas it can be, it's more of just sort of a veto issue in countries like France that are a little bit more established. So, all right, that's all I got for you today. The next question is up, and I'll get some lectures up this week. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.